Hello everybody, welcome to the latest in my series on the Tudors, and we are looking at the first key question for Henry VIII today. So Henry VIII, restoring and developing the powers of the monarchy. Well, he certainly does develop the powers of the monarchy, and we're going to have a look at some of the issues going through his reign. Henry VIII, I think, is going to be a lot more challenging to do in these videos than Henry VII was, because there's just so much more information. So I'm going to try and trim it down to the really key points. So first, let's look at the situation in 1509. Unlike Henry VII, Henry VIII didn't have to fight for his throne. He didn't have kind of large doubts over his blood claim. Unlike his father, he didn't inherit a throne or come into a throne which didn't have any money. Henry VII had left the crown finances in a really good state, and unlike his father, he didn't have to face any overmighty subjects. Henry VII did a really good job of controlling the power of the nobility, possibly too good a job, and this caused a little bit of an issue for Henry. So Henry is only 17 when he takes the throne. He's a matter of months away from being 18, but he is only 17. He had grown up as the spare, not the heir, and so he wasn't necessarily completely drilled and ready, but his brother had been dead quite a long time at this point, and therefore he had been being prepared. He was full of Renaissance ideas, idealistic views of chivalry. He loved tennis, he loved jousting in particular, he loved hunting. He had a desire to prove himself as a warrior king, to kind of live up to the ideals of old English kingship. The nobility saw him as a potential saviour from the oppression of the council learned in the law. So there really is a kind of honeymoon period at the beginning of Henry's reign, where everybody's really excited about this young, new, dynamic king and England going in a new direction. So as he's establishing himself as king, so one of the first things he does is that he marries Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his older brother. This at first seemed to appear to be a very happy marriage. Catherine appeared to have some influence over policy, and particularly the defence of England against Scotland. And this royal marriage consolidated Henry's standing in Europe, and his international standing, something that was really important to Henry. Henry does re-establish the position of the nobility to an extent. He executes Empson and Dudley, abolishes the Council Learned of Law in 1510. There is an early rise, therefore, in the position of the nobility, and particularly the nobles that Henry has grown up with. But from 1512, we start to see the promotion of Wolsey. Wolsey is a butcher's son from Ipswich. He's not a member of the nobility, and a lot of the power and influence that high members of the nobility would have been expecting instead fall to Wolsey. One of the good examples of this is in 1521, the Duke of Buckingham, who actually had a bloodline that tracked all the way back to Edward III, was executed for discussing succession. And again, this was seen as the real power of Wolsey's influence in getting rid of the Duke of Buckingham. So Henry wanted to establish himself as a warrior king, and he saw conquest and glory in France. He had early successes in this. He had successes in Scotland and France in 1512 and 1513, including the Battle of the Spurs in France and Battle of Flodden up in Scotland. But the financial cost of all this is really horrendous, and Henry inherited the crown financially in a really strong position, but he manages to put a huge hole in that and reverse that strong position within the first few years of his reign. We then enter this period where Wolsey very much is the key figure next to Henry, and there's the debate in terms of power of the monarchy here, in terms of whether Wolsey is the puppet master or whether he is merely a servant of the king. Henry is largely at this stage disregards the idea of councillor government, instead focusing all the power of the day-to-day running in the hands of Thomas Wolsey, and Henry just dips in and looks at the bits that he was interested in. And he gave Wolsey lots of positions in both government and in church. So Wolsey ends up full of kind of key positions, and he seems to be the second power in England. Now, there is an area where Wolsey struggles to control, and this is known as the Privy Chamber, and this is the inner sanctum of the king. And in here, Henry tended to keep a lot of these young nobles that he'd grown up with alongside him. They often referred to as his minions. They weren't necessarily small and yellow, and speaking in some form of French. So Wolsey's control is not absolute. And Wolsey can be seen to use his powers to serve both the king and the people, and we see, for example, reform of the courts to help the poor, but he also seems to be using some of the power to his own ends. There was the famous example of Amos Paulet, who had humiliated Wolsey earlier in his career, and Wolsey got his revenge by summoning Paulet to appear before him, and then keeping him waiting in daily attendance for more than 5 years. And Paulet was made very strongly aware that if he left, he would be found as being guilty in contempt of court and would have all his property confiscated. So Wolsey had no intention of seeing him, but made him keep coming to him. And we see a lot of stuff that comes out of this where there is lots of people at the time, and some historians who have looked at it and said, right, actually the real power in England at this point is Wolsey, not Henry. I'm not fully convinced by that. I think ultimately power lies in Henry's hands. Wolsey's powers were quite wide-ranging. He was Archbishop of York in 1514, became Chancellor in 1515, as well as becoming a cardinal. He was papal legate from 1518, Bishop of Durham, which holds huge power in the north of England, for 1523. He appeared to be able to persuade and manipulate the king, and then he had the legal powers and many. I mean, he had 500 servants, but he also had a kind of a whole network of informants and things like that, and he was able to use all this to intimidate potential rivals. He survives his failure over the amicable grant in 1525, which goes horribly wrong and is a big climb down for both Wolsey and Henry. But the counter-argument to Wolsey being this all-powerful figure is that his position really depends on pleasing the king. Wolsey has no basis of power of his own, only what Henry gives to him, and anything that Henry gives to him he can take off him. And ultimately, when Wolsey fails to achieve the divorce for the king, and the king sees him as being essentially trying to serve two masters, the Pope and himself, which when it comes to the discussion of the king's great matter and the divorce, and that can't be done, then Wolsey falls. He actually dies before facing a treason trial, which he probably would have seen him being executed. So if we look at the great matter in more detail, now the great matter and the split from Rome certainly brought Henry more power, and therefore it permanently increased the power of the English monarchy. It brought more wealth as well. Essentially what Henry's now been treated as, he's been treated as an emperor, not merely a king. He's no longer accountable to the Pope, or the Bishop of Rome as he would refer to him at this point. And his subjects, most significantly obviously his wife, Catherine, would not be able to appeal to Rome. So therefore the ultimate power, the ultimate law is Henry. And this comes through the Act of Restraints of Appeals in 1533. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 makes him head of the Church, and the Treason Act of 1534 means that anybody who speaks against the king, against the supremacy, calls him a heretic, accuses him of causing a schism with the church, they could be tried for treason, just as anyone would be if they put it in writing or they carried out treason in action. Now, you can look at this and say this is an example of tyranny. This is Henry giving himself incredible power, and that essentially if anybody speaks against him, he can have them executed. And historians are slightly divided on this in terms of whether this really is part of Henry taking incredible amount of power and living and ruling like a tyrant, and others saying, well, actually, although there are famous examples, for example, Thomas More, that actually, particularly against ordinary people, the Treason Act was used fairly sparingly. Now, Henry definitely gains all these new powers for the monarchy, and therefore has developed the power of the monarchy. It has increased, but there is some arguments as well. But he has to rely on Cromwell and Parliament to gain these new powers. And some historians have looked at it and said that this is a revolution in government, notably historians like Elton, and have argued that Parliament's role is completely transformed. Now that is quite strongly debated, because there is the 7-year Parliament. They do seemingly have an enormous amount of power during this, but it fairly quickly goes back to normal. And remember, Parliament only sits when the King wants it to, and generally gives the King pretty much what he wants. But so we see a massive growth of power here, but we also see what will be a potential rival for English kings emerging at this point as well, which is Parliament. Whether talking about that as a rival in power to the King is premature in the reign of Henry VIII, and I think that probably is the case. Now, Wolsey is replaced by Cromwell. Henry seems to take more interest in the more of the day-to-day running of England at this point, and so Cromwell's powers are probably not quite as wide-ranging as Wolsey's were. And again, there's a debate on how much power Cromwell had over Henry. He's often seen as kind of the English Machiavelli. He's seen as very manipulative, very, very intelligent, and by some being completely unscrupulous. Again, Cromwell had a very humble background, and so he's completely reliant on the King's favour, particularly because Cromwell, a bit like Wolsey, had many, many enemies at court. Anne Boleyn initially seemed to have great hold over Henry, so again, his wives might be another area which cast some doubt over the ultimate power of Henry. And Anne Boleyn seemed to notably move Henry in terms of religious policy, but her hold faded. She has the accusations of incest and adultery, and she is executed. And we then get the next marriage to Jane Seymour, which seems to do Cromwell great good in terms of in furthering his power. But then we see the sad death of Jane following the birth of Edward, and then Cromwell tries to create another marriage, again showing this thing with him trying to please Henry. And this then ultimately again goes slightly awry, and Henry essentially disposes of Cromwell, and ultimately that really does suggest to us again about the importance of the position of power. Now, Henry might well have regretted what he does to Cromwell and the rashness of his actions, but ultimately it shows that the power is in his hand, and he can dispense of his advisors if he so wants to. And there was again some suggestion in doing all of this that Henry had been manipulated by the Duke of Norfolk through his niece Catherine Howard, who would go on to be wife number 5 for Henry. So again, ultimately all the power and decisions seem to come back to Henry, but there is always a suggestion that maybe he isn't this all-powerful king at all times, and there are people manipulating him as we go through. The final years of Henry's reign see this massive area of factionalism, and what we see is a conservative faction headed by Norfolk, Gardiner and Wriothesley, and they wanted to reverse some of the religious reforms. Essentially they're Catholic. And then we see so they're the conservative faction. We see a reform faction, which are Edward Seymour and Cranmer and Catherine Parr, one of Henry's 6th wife, who are pushing for greater religious reform. So the conservative faction seemed to hold sway to start off with, particularly with Henry besotted with his very young queen Catherine Howard. But when that all goes wrong and she is executed, Henry marries Catherine Parr, and the reform faction take the upper hand. Norfolk, this kind of leader of the conservative faction, tries to get at the reforming Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and also at Catherine Parr herself. And he tries to get them both charged with heresy, but those things fail. And by the end of Henry's reign, Edward Seymour is very firmly in a position of dominance, and he is a reformer, and he is the uncle of Edward, and he's going to carry out kind of the smooth transition to the power of his nephew. Now, another area historians have focused on is on the Privy Chamber. We talked earlier about the minions. A particular important group are the Grooms of the Stool. and there has been suggestion that they had great influence over Henry. Now, again, notably in this power struggle in the last years of Henry's reign, we've got Sir Anthony Denny, who held positions and held the position, and at the end he was a very strong reformer. He controlled, and again this is why it's important at the end, he controlled access to this massively overweight, bedridden Henry, and so if you wanted to see Henry, you had to get past Denny, and if Denny is looking to favour those who want reform and stand against those who want conservative action, then who Henry's seeing and what Henry's hearing is going to be affected by that. Previous key figures in the Privy Chamber included Norris, who was one of the people who was executed for adultery with Anne Boleyn, as was George Boleyn himself. So, power of the monarchy under Henry definitely develops. He doesn't face the same struggles as his father, but he does have this massive growth of the power of the monarchy, with the split with Rome is great matter, with the Act of Supremacy, with the fact that you could no longer appeal to Rome, with the enormous kind of explosion of wealth he gets from the dissolution of monasteries, and also from the Treason Acts, which essentially means that anybody who speaks against him in any way can face the horrors of execution. And Henry VIII is often seen by historians and portrayed in popular portrayals as this horrendous tyrant. And again, that might well be the truth of the matter. It might not be quite the whole truth of the matter, because there's this other element that we see that comes through the sources and the historiography, where there seems to be key figures at all different points who might well have been manipulating Henry, and therefore that all these decisions and actions that he takes might not really have been his own. And we look at Wolsey and Cromwell and the grooms of the stool, and we look at the conservative and reform factions towards the end of his reign. So is Henry really this all-powerful king who could do whatever he wanted, or was he being manipulated by wives and ministers and members of his privy chamber? So it's quite an interesting dynamic in there about Henry and his powers. In terms of the overall power of the monarchy, it definitely increases under Henry VIII, as we see the English monarchs taking control of the church, which gives them another area of control, and it also gives them a huge growth in the financial area of control that they have as well. Right, I hope this has been helpful to you. It should help you answer any questions on the power of the monarchy under Henry VIII. I will be doing a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in here in more detail when we get on and look at things like government. All right, thank you very much for watching, everybody. I'll speak to you all again soon.